Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. For those of you who don't know me, my name is John Brandon. I'm Senior Director for International Relations Programs for the Asia Foundation here in Washington. On behalf of the Asia Foundation, I'm pleased to welcome you to the launch of our report, U.S.-China-Southeast Asia Relations, Challenges and Opportunities for Regional Cooperation. You can't hear? Okay. This mic says it's on. It's got a red dot. So, all right, I'll make believe I'm in New Jersey and speak louder. For those of you who don't know me, my name is John Brandon. I'm Senior Director for International Relations Programs for the Asia Foundation here in Washington. I'm pleased to welcome you today for the launch of our report on U.S.-China-Southeast Asia Relations, Challenges and Opportunities for Regional Cooperation. We have hard copies of this report, and some of you may already have one, and there are certainly reports outside, so please feel free to take a copy. If you wish to download it, if you go to the Asia Foundation's website at www.asiafoundation.org, you should be able to find it on our webpage. I want to extend a special welcome to two Asian ambassadors in the audience, Ambassador Mohammad Nazri Abdul Aziz from Malaysia, and also Ambassador Jose Luis Gutierrez from Timor-Leste. So thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. In May of this year, the Foundation's International Relations Program organized a workshop in Thailand in cooperation with the Center for Security and Strategy at Tsinghua University in Beijing, and with the Thailand Development Research Institute in Bangkok. We brought together 21 distinguished scholars, think tank representatives, and government officials from the United States, China, and Southeast Asia to explore the central question: what are the top priorities and concerns of the United States, China, and Southeast Asia in the coming decades? And inevitably, the workshop was drawn to a number of related issues. Among them were changes and alliances in China, the U.S., and ASEAN, the status of ASEAN centrality, the politicalization of trade and investment in the region, the roles that China and the U.S. intend to play, and what are Southeast Asia's expectations from its relations with the United States and China. This report offers American, Chinese, and Southeast Asian perspectives from the workshop's two-day discussion. We're very pleased to have the report's authors with us today, and let me introduce them briefly. Dr. David M. Lampton is the Hyman Professor Emeritus at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and former president of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. Dr. Lampton is currently a senior research fellow at SAIS's Foreign Policy Institute. He's also chairman emeritus of the Asia Foundation's Board of Trustees. His most recent book is Living U.S.-China Relations, From Cold War to Cold War, which was published earlier this year. Dr. Da Wei is the director of the Center for Security and Strategy, who's one of our partners at the workshop at Tsinghua University in Beijing. Professor Da Wei's research expertise covers China-U.S. relations and U.S. security and foreign policy, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region. Earlier this year, he was a senior fellow at Stanford University. And then our third speaker will be Dr. Kuik Cheng-Chwee. He's a professor of international relations at the University of Malaysia, Institute of Malaysian and International Studies in Kuala Lumpur. Both Dr. Da Wei and Dr. Kuik, they're no stranger to Washington. Dr. Kuik was also a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute at Johns Hopkins SAIS. And in 2020, along with Selina Ho in Singapore, they co-authored a book with Professor Lampton titled Rivers of Iron, Railroads and Chinese Power in Southeast Asia. Moderating today's panel is Ms. Yun Sun. She's a senior fellow and co-director of the East Asia program at the Stimson Center. Her expertise is in Chinese foreign policy, U.S.-China relations, and China's relations with neighboring countries and authoritarian regimes. Yun Sun was one of the workshop participants in Bangkok back in May and is familiar with the discussion that took place there. I also want to acknowledge other workshop participants from the U.S., China, and Southeast Asia who are either present today or are attending virtually in our virtual room today. We have Ms. Barbara Wiesel, who's a managing director of Rock Creek Global Advisors, as well as Dr. Brantley Womack, professor emeritus of foreign affairs at the University of Virginia. Virtually, we have Dr. Yawei Liu, who is a senior advisor on China at the Carter Center in Atlanta. Others joining us from China virtually are Dr. Liu Lin, who is a professor and specialist in Southeast Asian military at the Central Party School in Beijing, and Dr. Xiao Qian, Deputy Director at the Center for International Security and Strategy at Tsinghua University. And from Southeast Asia, virtually, we have Dr. Kirida Balbichit. She's the Director of the Economic Intelligence Service at the Thailand Development Research Institute, but she also served as the Southeast Asia co-chair of the workshop back in May. We also have Dr. Aaron Jed Rabina, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Philippines Asian Center in Manila, Mr. Asoka Raspon, who's deputy director at the Institute of Foreign Affairs in the Lao People's Democratic Republic in the ministry in Vientiane. And we also have Mr. Chi Trung Tran, who's Deputy Director General at the Institute of Foreign Policy and Strategic Studies at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Vietnam. So I want to thank especially workshop colleagues who are in China or Southeast Asia right now. It's very late in the evening for them, and so we appreciate them taking the time to participate in today's program. And then finally, I'd like to express my appreciation and the Asia Foundation's appreciation for the Carnegie Corporation of New York, who generously has supported this project. I'm asking, this is being recorded, and so I have to ask all of you that you consent to being recorded, and so I hope that you will all agree to that. And then, so with that, now let me turn the program over to Yun Sun. So thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you for first of all, hosting the seminar in the workshop in Bangkok, and also for organizing this report launch event here in DC. I know that you, the crew has following very busy schedule to New York and to San Francisco to talk about the research findings from a workshop and the reports. So wish you a very successful trip from that. I feel that throughout the years, Asia Foundation has emerged in Washington as a champion for Southeast Asia. There's no other organizations, either think tank or academic institutions, that have designated similar amount of effort to understanding Southeast Asia and also to promoting discussions and knowledge, awareness about Southeast Asia in Washington. So really admire the effort, and thank you so much for leading that effort. In terms of the issues that we're here to discuss today, US and China in Southeast Asia. Who doesn't love Southeast Asia? And who doesn't love US-China great power competition, right? So when you put these two together, we definitely have a very rich body of content that we can debate. And I feel that just like anything on Southeast Asia, I remember from our workshop, the 3 exciting days in Bangkok, for any Southeast Asian discussion among 4 people, you have 5 to 6 views. I feel that's what we also experienced during this process of understanding what is indeed the nature of US-China dynamic in Southeast Asia. So today, truly honored to be here to moderate this panel. You all have the reports, and for people online, probably you can download the reports from Asia Foundation website. So to begin with, I think we're going to invite our 3 authors to each very briefly talk about what their takeaways from the workshop and from the topics are, and what are the gist of their argument in terms of U.S.-China-Southeast Asia relations. So following the order of the report, Professor Lampton, perhaps I can invite you to share with us.
Thank you, Yun Sun. Glad to be here with everybody. Thank you for coming. just a measure of the interest there is in both the general topic and the region. So thank you for, and looking forward to receiving your wisdom as you ask us questions. So our paper is a starting point for discussion, not the end point. I also want to thank my colleagues, particularly from Asia, for making the long trip. And I think this is just a wonderful opportunity, this project, for all of us to listen to each other, which I think is not so often occurring these days. So enough for that. I do want to thank the Asia Foundation, and particularly the staff and Vanessa Crawford, in particular, of course, John and Yun Sun, for agreeing today to moderate this discussion. I should state the obvious, but reinforce it. What I have to say are my views. They're not certainly any sponsoring organization's views, or indeed any of us necessarily here, although we've honed our own views, I think, by listening to the others. So enough on that. I think if I try to just specify some of the takeaways, one is that I think we agree, but I certainly believe that big power competition is not a very good framework to foster cooperation, right? That may be a heterodox view in Washington, but I think, in fact, it's a problematic framework for getting the best either out of our bilateral relationship with China or in the interests of ourselves in relationship to Southeast Asia. Glad to elaborate that, but that would certainly be my sort of core motivation in participating in this project and developing views as a result of it. If you ask what might be a better framework, of course, there are all sorts of candidates for that, and we do have a complicated situation in which there is competition. So I'm not trying to argue there's no competition, but I'd like to hear us talking more about balance, stability, and growth. I'd rather hear more of those words and less on the competition, recognizing that, of course, all of those elements are in the situation that we face. Now, a second thing it sort of comes to my mind is that there are about three big macro forces that are driving us in, I think, an unhealthy direction. And that's my understatement. So what are the three power? First of all, I think securitization is really driving all bilateral. Is there a problem here? Okay.
There you go. There you go.
Could people hear in the back before? Okay. So big power securitization, I think, is one big thing that's driving it, because it immediately raises the question of what's the nature of our economic interaction in the world in the first case, and in the Southeast Asia in the second. Secondly, there's a growing trend, and I notice that here in Washington as well as in Beijing, frankly, and that's sort of certainly in the United States, industrial policy and protectionism. And this has all sorts of implications. And then when we bring in securitization, you get into export controls and what kinds of standards are you going to buy Huawei? Is Thailand going to use what kind of equipment? All of those kinds of issues. So you have, it seems to me, another macro trend is industrial policy, particularly in the United States, growing. It's always been present, in my view, in China, and protectionism. And it seems to me, just looking at what I hear as the discourse, both of our major political parties are embracing what we would have not too long ago called protectionist elements to their economic policy. Certainly a third thing is, I think, a macro driving force is the increased role of ideology. Just for example, in the United States, formulating things as autocracy versus democracy. This doesn't foster cooperation, and in fact suggests the purpose of policy is to change regimes. I mean, you just peel that idea back a little, and that's sort of what lies underneath. So that's, I think those are sort of thinking about the forces that are making this very complicated. I think those are at least three of them. Certainly another thing that I would say about this is that this circumstance of those three forces have been a long time in developing. It's sort of like peeling the layers of an onion. Where did this start? And I think that you couldn't argue this is definitive, but I get easily back to 1995, 96, and the missile imbroglio and China's decision to increase its military capability. I think that was an important time. And I had about 12 things which time doesn't permit us, but this has been a long time in developing, and it means under the best circumstance, it's going to be a long time in repairing. So I have no idea that there's a silver bullet quick fix here. Now it raises the question of how, I'll conclude on this note, what has really changed here? And it seems to me, if you ask what was engagement, broadly speaking, it was about reassurance, us reassuring as the two powers, and also reassuring our respective neighbors that we would responsibly manage that bilateral relationship with their interests in mind. And it seems to me that we've moved to deterrence. And if you think, what is the core of deterrence? It's credible threat. Well, you're not going to get very much cooperation with a threatening underneath of your policy. So it seems to me we have to get back into the direction of reassurance. Now, given the problems we face in the South China Sea and Taiwan, deterrence is going to be part of the picture. But how can we make deterrence not the sole driving force in this relationship? So that's sort of my thinking, and I'll pass it on to Dawei. I should do that.
Thank you, Professor. It does raise a question. Well, if it's deterrence versus reassurance, where does leave Southeast Asia? What the alignment strategy might look like. But before we go there, we'll invite Dawei to give us a Chinese perspective on regional cooperation. Is it dead? Is it still going? Is it still possible?
Yeah, thank you, Yun. Of course, this is not a Chinese perspective, but a Chinese perspective, a personal view. First of all, want to thank Asia Foundation for make all this happen. A very productive workshop in Bangkok earlier this year in May, and then this event. Thank you for taking your time and join this event. So in past 1 year, because the China-U.S. relations has deteriorated so much, so we had to travel to different countries as a third countries to discuss with some American colleagues on different issues. Earlier this morning, I mentioned that I went to Dubai last year discussing the Ukraine issue with American colleagues. And earlier this year, I went to Geneva, talk about the Middle East issue with the American counterparts. And this May, we went to Bangkok, discussing with the American colleagues on the Middle East, on the Southeast Asian countries. So on all those workshops, meetings, one of the things that surprised me a lot was actually the differences between the Chinese and American, at least the scholars or interlocutors, are not so big as we expected. So when we started our discussion, we think that all our interests are against each other. But when we finish our discussion, I think we do have a lot of overlapping parts. So I think China and the US do have many shared interests in Southeast Asian region with ASEAN country, and that's a very critical, important region for both China and the United States. And of course, ASEAN countries do want to get along with the two major power well. Having said that, I think Professor Lampton mentioned this. We have a dominating framework of competition, strategic competition between China and the US. So then we fell into a dilemma that, since we are in this strategic competition, so both countries, but I will say the Americans are created more, but China maybe do the similar thing, created a lot of programs, strategies, initiatives that exclude the other side. I mean, China may have some initiatives like the American colleagues may say BRI, for example, in which we cooperate with the ASEAN country a lot on that, but the US is not in that. And on the US side, you have the Indo-Pacific strategy, you have IPAF, you have the US have its ally and partnership in the region, and the US have the Blue Dot Network and others. So with those exclusive, mutually exclusive programs and the strategies, the more we cooperate, I say we, I mean China or the US. I mean, the more we work with the ASEAN country, the more we hate each other. I mean, China and the US. We view each other as those kind of cooperation with ASEAN country as a part of the competition between China and the US. Then the ASEAN country has been caught in between, in the middle, feel very uncomfortable with that. So I think looking forward, if we want to change the situation, I think first and foremost is the task is for China and the US to lower its intensity of the competition and also reduce the scope of competition. I think this competition, to be honest, I think it's an inflated competition. Yeah, it's true that we have some competition over, like say, military or high tech. What else? Maybe in the Northeast Asia or on Taiwan issue, I think we have some competition, or I mean, inevitable conflicts of the interest. But in other geopolitical issues like Southeast Asian country, the relations, trilateral relations, or in the area like not so strategically important economic sectors like trade, I don't think we have competition. I think the two countries has been, both sides, I think, exaggerate this competition, and we are trapped in the many wild imagination and anger caused by interaction, and also the lack of understanding due to the limited field study and the person and face-to-face interaction between China and the US. So if we can reduce that, if we can lower the securitization level, as Professor Lampton mentioned, then I think these ASEAN country will feel much better. So in the paper that I wrote, I advocate for the open regionalism. I think it's really important for China and the US to work with the ASEAN country on a non-mutually exclusive basis. I mean, we need to do something together. Maybe we can only do something on a less sensitive area like non-traditional security, like climate change, like environment protection. This morning we discussed that, and like on people-to-people tie. But we need to show to the other side that what we are doing with ASEAN country is not against the other side. I think this is something very important. So that's what I call open regionalism. I mean, China and the US are building close regionalism. We want to build with work with ASEAN country. Americans want to work with the ASEAN country, but we exclude each other. So when the US advocate for its Indo-Pacific strategy, if you read that documents, China has not been mentioned at all. So China is not part of the Indo-Pacific strategy because China is a target of the Indo-Pacific strategy. Then how can China view that strategy? if you feel you are targeted. So at the same time, I think, of course, the unity and the centrality of ASEAN country, I think it's also very important. I think ASEAN country do have strong agency there. It's not a grassland that on which the two elephants fight. I think ASEAN country have its, China really hope ASEAN country can maintain its unity, because if ASEAN countries split, then maybe China will dominate some countries, the US will dominate some the other countries. I don't think that's a best solution for China. I think we'd like a neutral, unified ASEAN country, which and also have its agency to play a role to invite both China and the US and other countries, other like Japan, South Korea, to work together. And this is a bad thing. I mean, for China, it's in China's interest. So, and of course, in others' interest too. So I think sometimes we say small horse, big wagons. Now the two big wagons, China and the US, we fight against each other. So we are expecting the smaller horse, the horse to lead those two wagons, at least to set up some venue for the wagons to move towards the same direction. Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dawei. I always learn so much from your writing and also from your just the way that you approach the issue. I think what you just said probably will raise a lot of questions in the room. I definitely have a lot of questions. But one thing that I find very interesting is that the level of anxiety about this competition in China and in the United States seems to be very different. I think in China, there's a tendency to say, what competition? Why are we competing, right? That who started it?
I just wrote a piece, I said on the Olympic Games, so the athletes compete for the gold medal. So what are the gold medal we are competing for? I don't know. I have no idea about what is the gold medal. Is Southeast Asia country a gold medal that we are competing for? I don't think so.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
very the level of anxiety here in Washington about this strategic competition or the strategic competition with China. And it raises an interesting question that whether we do see everything like a nail, that everything that we see that in relationship relation to China is a target for competition. And I know that Professor Liebersohl many years ago wrote the defining piece on the lack of trust between US and China being a original source of this anxiety and of the problems in the bilateral level. So maybe Professor Liebersohl will have an answer for us at some point. Last but not least, coming to how Southeast Asia feels about this, we have Professor Kuik from Malaysia, who is well known in the region for his study on alignment strategies for Southeast Asian nations as a smaller, weaker partners in this dynamics. So Professor Kuik, please.
Thanks very much, Sun Yun, my friend for a long time. And a very good afternoon to everyone. Very glad to be here and see many friends and also familiar faces here. And let me begin by thanking the organizer, the Asia Foundation, particularly John, Vanessa, and also the team for having me here joining this panel after the Bangkok workshop. I'm particularly happy for this panel, mainly because of Professor Mike Lampton. Is my teacher when I was here some 20 years ago, used to be across the road at Johns Hopkins, and he's my teacher and also an important member of my committee, the dissertation committee. And later on, as John mentioned, we were also the co-author and perhaps a co-conspirator for the 5-year book project, The River of Iron. And of course, he continued to be one of my mentors for life. So we're very glad to join this panel along with Mike, alongside Dr. Dawei, whom I first met in May, August, alongside with Dr. Sun Yun. So with that, let me make my 3 points for the next 6 minutes or so. But before I make the 3 points, clearly with the presence of Ambassador Datuk Seri Nazri, Ambassador of Malaysia to United States, and also his staff, Shamsul, let me say that the presence of Ambassador and also the team indicates that whatever I'm saying for the next 6 minutes only represent myself. So with that, we are ready for the 3 points. Early on, Sun Yun talked about anxiety, and that is A word, yeah. So I thought my 3 points are about 3 A's. And these 3 A's are not random. They are selected for a number of reasons. First, of course, I want to reflect how my Southeast Asian colleagues during the Bangkok discussion, they present a lot of perspectives. And we know Southeast Asia is not a country, not a big power, but a region of very diverse countries. We are so different in almost all variables that social sciences will highlight. And therefore, we have very different views on virtually every issues, from Ukraine, from Taiwan, from a lot of contentious issues, such as Gaza issue. And on Myanmar, on South China Sea, you do see a diverse perspective. But these 3 points highlight that despite the diversity, the diverse opinions and approaches, Southeast Asian countries, 10 countries, and would be East Timor joining, would be 11, we do have some common denominators, especially when it comes to this middle state mindset sandwich between the 2 competing powers. So the 3 points I think reflect those common perspectives, maybe different degrees and all that. And I thought that the 3 points, the first point to mention, as I said, 3 A's. The first A is about asymmetry or power asymmetry. Professor Bradley Womack is here, and then many of us know him as the kind of the king of asymmetry theory in international relations. So we do know that asymmetry means in simple terms, meaning that there is a vast power gap. There is an unequal capability and unequal attention between the stronger and also a weaker. So asymmetry is a very important word to set things in perspective. Southeast Asia between US-China, of course, you can say that it's an interstate relationship, but state are unequal, despite the sovereign equality, are unequal in terms of capability. So in the real sense of the word, Southeast Asia, among a US-China, Southeast Asia triangular, we are the weaker side. And weaker simply is an objective description that we are weaker in terms of capability, so on and so forth. For the context of today's discussion, and again from Southeast Asia perspective, is that asymmetry means that we realize from Jakarta, a big country but not big power, to smaller countries like in maritime Southeast Asia and mainland Southeast Asia, we all realize that the power gap between Southeast Asia individual and as a group, with Washington, with US, and also China, means that these 2 competing powers can harm us and help us more than any other actors in the international system in more than one way. So meaning that there are good things, there are also bad things, and that are part and parcel of the anxiety. Even though now with a US-China rivalry, we are benefited. Some of us are benefited from US-China trade war, as China +1. You see Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, and so on and so forth are benefited from as companies are shifting out of China or diversifying, adding more firms, we are benefited. But we realize that there is always 2 sides of the same coin. Benefits and risks, opportunities and challenges come hand in hand. Southeast Asia, we cannot say that we only like the positive, we don't like the negative. You can say that, but we knew that we would face those realities. So asymmetry in the real terms, meaning that we realize that there will always be challenges and risks, even we try to enjoy the benefits. And we know that asymmetry also means that we know that it is beyond us. And this is where my second point is, agency. Professor David Shambhawa is here, and then we know that he has a very important book some 4 years ago about where great powers meet and Southeast Asia between the competing powers. So in his book, he raised a lot of agency, but I thought agency it's a kind of a critical word for us to understand. Even though Southeastern countries realize the asymmetry is out there, but asymmetry doesn't mean that we in Southeast Asia accept power hierarchy. We make distinction between power asymmetry and power hierarchy. Power asymmetry meaning that it's a given reality, the big gap. You can't change it. Whoever the leader in White House, whoever the leader in Zhongnanhai, we realize that power gap will always be there. But does acceptance of power asymmetry translate into an acceptance of power hierarchy, meaning that we have to kowtow, say yes all the time to bigger power? Certainly not. Why is that? Southeast Asian countries, almost all of us, are post-colonial countries. Autonomy matters a lot in our external policy, unless and until we have no choice. We do not want to kowtow to accept the power hierarchy. So this is where agency comes in. And agency takes a number of forms. To cut the long story short, I know time is running out. And then even though I want to avoid the eye contact from Yun Sun, I know that proximity means that he can just stop me, right? So very quickly, agency in the context of Southeast Asia today, they take place multiple forms, but 2 levels. The group level, ASEAN as a group, but also individual countries level. I know ASEAN has been dismissed as like talk shop and then for photography session, very limited and all that. But a good way of seeing ASEAN, the role and limitation of ASEAN is that to see ASEAN as a 3I organization. 3I in the sense that ASEAN as a regional grouping will always be imperfect. Nothing is perfect. Will always be very often inadequate to tackle a Myanmar, South China Sea issue and all that. But despite being imperfect and inadequate, ASEAN will always be indispensable. We are indispensable for handling the intra-ASEAN problems. That is a bigger problem for all of us. We are indispensable because of we know that ASEAN provides a platform, not perfect, inadequate, but indispensable for us to hang together to deal with the bigger powers in and outside the region. ASEAN is also indispensable to handle non-traditional security issues, so on and so forth. So that helps us to have some agency. ASEAN as an agency to create cooperation. It's being kind of unappreciated and also undervalued ASEAN in the sense that, you know, everybody talk about ASEAN centrality, but without really appreciating the values that ASEAN and ASEAN-led mechanism is bringing to the region, including not just Southeast Asia, but all dialogue partners. One good example, again, because of the time, would be the RCEP, right? Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. This is the largest economic free trade arrangement in the world, right? And RCEP would not have happened without ASEAN and ASEAN-led mechanism. Without ASEAN +3, without East Asia Summit, RCEP would not have happened. You know that Northeast Asian countries are the main economic powerhouses, but because of political problems, they can never come up with something equivalent to RCEP. But through ASEAN and ASEAN-led platform, you know there is an agency of not just avoiding conflict, but we're actually providing space to create cooperation that benefits not just ASEAN countries, but also the dialogue partners, whoever value the ASEAN centrality to create cooperation that benefits a different region. And individual levels, we won't go into that, but maybe that will come up in the Q&A session. Every countries in Southeast Asia, in one way or another, we try to pursue the non-alignment goal through multi-alignment means. And that is the ASEAN Southeast Asian Agency in the contemporary 21st century. Non-alignment is not new. We talked about that during the Cold War. But non-alignment in this current context is more a policy goal. It is the goal. The goal of we want to ensure that we are not siding with one against the other. We want to continue to be neutral, but in an active way. How do we pursue this non-alignment neutrality goal? We need some means, approaches. And the means and approaches, even though government do not announce it, is what academics will call as multi-alignment. You make sure that you adopt active, inclusive, but also adaptive approaches to pursue multiple partnership economically, but also strategic security, so on and so forth. Yeah, RCEP is one within ASEAN, but you know BRI is something that happening in Southeast Asia. But you know, multi-alignment means that while countries are pursuing a cooperation with a BRI with China, we also make it a point, IPEF. And before that, TPP, CPTPP is very much part and parcel of the picture, right? So the third, the final point, the third A is called as allergic. You might be wondering, this is not about food, not about, you know, the health. Why talk about allergic? Allergic will be the third and final A that capture the ambivalent and pragmatic mindset and anxiety. In the light of the first A, asymmetry, the second A, agency, we are allergic on a number of things. One is that we are allergic to certain type of alliance system, right? Some say that with China's growing assertive action, countries in Southeast Asia, especially those with maritime dispute, should have come together, rally, behind, the US-centric alliance system, right? Well, alliance system is the principal solution for many countries, like-minded countries, for example. But in Southeast Asia, you do know that we are allergic to alliance in the sense that alliance is important for various reasons. When you are being threatened principally by a principal danger, Philippines maybe explain that, but for other ASEAN countries, we do not really see things are so black and white. Rather, there are shades of gray. Because of that, we are allergic to alliance that is targeted and also can be a kind of action-reaction. And therefore, many countries are pursuing some form of alignment without alliance. And we think that that is good because of it is inclusive. It is also active. And more importantly, it is adaptive. Adaptive in the sense that by insisting of no alliance, we keep distance from Quad, AUKUS and all that, doesn't mean that we will stay as it is. You can always adjust, add values when it is necessary. But short of that, I think ASEAN countries' alliance allergy is a good news rather than bad news. And I think that reflects many sentiments across the ASEAN capitals. I will stop here. Sorry for taking longer than planned for.
Thank you, Cheng-Chwee. So asymmetry, agency, and allergy. I was wondering about why not just ambivalence? Why allergy?
I used that before. I don't want to repeat.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Well, this is terrific. We have a lot of food for thought. I definitely have my own questions, but I understand that we have about 35 minutes for Q&A. For anyone who is watching online, feel free to use the Q&A function on Zoom to pose your question. And for our audience here, if you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for the mic. Well, we have one question in the front, Professor Shenbao.
Well, thank you. And first, thanks to the Asia Foundation and John for undertaking this report. Southeast Asia in general and U.S. and Southeast Asia and the U.S.-China context here in Washington is deeply neglected. So thanks for bringing attention to the issue. So I have to admit, I'm quite skeptical of the cooperation paradigm when it comes to U.S.-China relations anywhere, including in Southeast Asia. However, in fact, I led a similar report just 2 years ago, an Asia Society report on U.S.-China competition in Southeast Asia. This one's on cooperation. So, but even in our report, and I personally, it's not zero sum. There is scope for cooperation in some areas. So I'd like to ask just a couple of questions to get the panel's comments and to bring Sun Yun particularly into the conversation because you've worked so much in this area yourself. The couple of areas that occur to me where there is potentiality for cooperation is first in the lower Mekong Basin development and management of water resources. So what kind of complementarity do you see there? And of course, Professor Lampton, Professor Kuik wrote a book together about water management in the region, so please chime in. But more broadly, what about sort of complementarity in ODA, aid work between the United States and China in mainland, and for that matter, maritime Southeast Asia, in Cambodia for sure, Laos, parts of Indonesia, southern Philippines, perhaps even Myanmar. Do you see complementarity between the American and the Chinese ODA programs in the region? And then the other area that strikes me as a potential area of cooperation is in sea lane security. Okay, given the enormous volume of maritime merchandise trade and energy transportation that passes through the Malacca Strait and up through the South China Sea, sea lane security is vital. So what potential for naval cooperation between the United States and China, or in conjunction with ASEAN navies, might you see here to keep the sea lanes secure and open? So I guess my view is that there could be de facto cooperation via complementary actions, not coordinated between Washington and Beijing, but sort of undertaken individually and in conjunction with other ASEAN states. So I just wonder if you could comment on those two areas, please.
Thank you, Professor Shenbao. That's a great question, and with a lot of different layers and depths. I wonder, Professor Lampton, would you start and we'll come this way. Thank you.
What I would say is I think the idea of distinguishing between coordination, collateral, parallel efforts, but not formal agreements is really where we're going to have to start on almost whatever functional area you're talking about. Just in an earlier meeting today, we talked about coordinating on the plastics in the ocean problem. There's something intrinsically that I would say involves the least neuralgic spots and the most collective benefit. So I'd add environmental cooperation, particularly plastics, as an area. So, but I found also you gave some examples. I was surprised to hear you say them because the conflictual content is actually fairly high. You mentioned Mekong cooperation, and I agree, but there's a bit of a problem. That is, China's the headwater state, and that always creates problems for everybody downstream. And the US maybe have a global ecological interest in the abstract, but our tangible interests are much less than either China or the states that it's flowing through. So I see and there's big cooperation problems here. Myanmar, I mean, you don't get very far in that discussion and you get to human rights, right? And that also, you go to Cambodia and you got problems cooperating there because we're frankly not willing to invest until they change their human rights situation in our view, right? So I see a problem there. And then sea lane security, I mean, that brings up the whole naval expansion and real estate expansion and development of not bases, but places for pre-positioning and so on. So I think, we have this sense that we need to do cooperative, complementary and parallel things, but almost every example we would think of has some seemingly debilitating impediment, right? So I think you started out, I thought you were going to be more unsympathetic to the cooperation, but by the time you finished, I'm the one that's skeptical about some of these areas. So I think that's that's what I see as the problem here.
Professor Dawei, any thought on this?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on those three areas, specific area of cooperation, but my hunch is, yeah, that's difficult. I mean, it will, the government need to get involved, and also it's more or less connected with human rights or political security or security thing, like Myanmar, like Sealand. Having said that, I do think there are still a lot of things even less sensitive than what you said, like disaster relief, like environmental protection. I think those are maybe we need to start from that, not directly related to the security. I mean, started from that to build confidence first, then move to the program that you mentioned. I think it's maybe the second step. Yeah.
Professor.
On complementary issue, I think similar with the agency aspect, it takes place, I think, at two levels: the individual countries level with both US and also China, but also the ASEAN level, the group level, right? And at the group level, there are two immediate examples that illustrate that. One is about the security aspect. ADMM plus, right, provide a mechanism where both US and China, in fact, beyond other second tier, the next tier powers can also come in to play up the maximize the complementary. So those are the security aspect. Diplomatic and development, again, other ASEAN-led mechanism. East Asia Summit is a good example. Again, a lot of complementary can be done. Individual level infrastructure, connectivity and all that. I mean, US is not a new kid in the block, has been a long-standing developmental partners, just like Japan. So today, even though US no longer offer capital investment for construct infrastructure, but good practices, capacity building clearly arose that Southeast Asia countries can benefit individually. And then again, China provide some investment and PPP. There are new forms of cooperation under the second phase of a Belt and Road or a Global Development Initiative. So I think complementary means that the more the merrier, and shouldn't be just the US and China. I think the next year powers, second level power dynamics should come in as well.
I don't disagree with Professor Kuik. I think the more the merrier is a politically correct statement. But when you are great power, you always think about the relative gains rather than absolute gains, right? So I think the fundamental challenge to US-China cooperation, even in the development field in Southeast Asia, is norms and rules. Whose norms are we following? Like when we think about Lower Mekong, water transparency, the information that's being published. I think the Chinese would argue that, well, data is a matter of national security. So they don't release the data as the Lower Mekong countries would require. And there's also the question of the compatibility of the different development models, right? And some of the speakers already talked about the different political model, like in the case of Myanmar. So I think essentially the cooperation issue comes back to whose norms or whose rules are we following in terms of these cooperation projects. And currently, I don't see China and US could overcoming their diverging perception over these norms and rules. But it doesn't prohibit transaction level cooperation. On specific technical issues, I do see that there are those spaces for cooperation. If I can move on to the next question, we have a question from Ambassador Scott Marcial. Hi, Ambassador. The question is for Professor Kuik. Ambassador wonders if you see any change or strengthening in bilateral relations between some or all ASEAN members in response to pressures from US-China competition. Has this competition facilitated more bilateral cooperation or bilateral coordination, such as between Vietnam and the Philippines?
Thank you, Ambassador. That's an excellent question. So I have two answers. One is short, one is more elaborated. The short answer is certainly yes. And we see that in many forms, security, defense, and also economic. We won't have time for that. So the slightly longer answer would be, I think let's take kind of a Philippines is one. And then we also know that Philippines is one of the 4 ASEAN claimant countries when it comes to South China Sea. So out of these 4 ASEAN claimant countries in South China Sea, you do see variations, different approaches. Philippines' approach clearly under the current president is alliance-centric, not new formula, but old formula. But after witnessing Duterte's kind of like quite accommodative approach towards China, now alliance is back to the cornerstone of Philippines' policy for bilateral relations, but also for South China Sea. But this, and they have the conditions of what we mentioned earlier on, under the profound and direct threat, the danger. Smaller countries naturally would want to opt for alliance first, alliance based. But these conditions might not necessarily be reflected evenly. Vietnam, they were up and down. During the oil rig, alignment was being put forward as a main cornerstone, right? But once China behaves slightly differently, the threat level kind of fluctuate. Vietnam pursue the kind of policy in a way that we can say that it's a neutrality plus, right? Neutrality plus in what sense? You do see a two-pronged approach. Two-pronged approach in a sense that as yes, the just-in-case instinct push Vietnam and many other lesser countries to increase the defense alignment. With the US, former enemy, doesn't matter, we need that. There is a convergence. They increase defense partnership with the United States under alignment but no alliance. At the same time, other like-minded countries, Japan, India, Australia also come into this picture. But at the same time, Vietnam is doing the opposite with China, right? They use the party-to-party communist links to send a signal to China that as I'm doing that, this is not necessarily targeting against you. We have the party and party. Even on security, non-traditional security aspect, you see Vietnam is hedging, is two-pronged in so many ways. concurrently, as the Vietnam collaborate with the US, both on traditional and non-traditional aspect, they are doing something similar with China. So that's two-pronged policy, meaning that yes, the changing dynamics, big power competition are more intensified. Big power, smaller countries realize that that increased uncertainty will push them to hedge even more deeply rather than less. And hedge more deeply, meaning that you need to diverse even more actively and inclusively. And the similar theme can be observed in many other countries, even beyond the climate countries. Indonesia will be a good example. A few weeks ago, that's the last example, and then we'll stop here. A few weeks ago, in fact, we knew that within the same week, you heard that two interesting stories are coming up from Indonesia. On the one hand, we read about Indonesia and Australia have increased their long-standing defense partnership, not alliance, but alignment. But just 2 days before the announcement, we also read the news. Indonesia and China are forging the first ever kind of a mechanism involving China in Southeast Asia, the 2+2 platform involving defense and foreign ministry. So this two-pronged approach is a clear indicator of what we call as a hedging approach, in the sense that you want to create options just in case things become more uncertain that might harm you in more than one way. You have some options to hold on to.
Great, great. That's a great answer, because I have a follow-up question for Professor Da Wei. As a, now I'm triggered as a sinologist. Is China sensitive enough to these signals being sent by Southeast Asian countries about their multi-alignment, about their hedging strategy? Because a lot of times it feels that Beijing is quite blind to all these actions, and Beijing's course of action is predetermined, quite independent from what Southeast Asia may or may not do. So do you think that these strategies actually have an impact over China's perception and strategy?
Yes, I think my personal observation is China is not very sensitive to that, to those changes, because in our decision-making process, of course, we think ASEAN country is important, but ASEAN country is, in the ladder of the decision maker process, I think Southeast Asian countries are at the lower level, at secondary level, I will say, yeah, secondary, because like people who make South China, the policy on South China Sea, or people are making policy like China-US. I think that those are the focus of China's policy. So we first and foremost we tend to view our ASEAN country, the policy to ASEAN countries through that lens. That means South China Sea, that's territory integrity and the U.S.-China competition or U.S.-China relations. So maybe you talk to the diplomats and officials who focus on ASEAN country, they are very sensitive to that, but can their observation, be passed to the top layer? I mean, this is something I doubt. So I do think we have not paid enough attention to that. This is a pity, but this is the reality. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Da Wei. So if I may follow up to Professor Da Wei's comment and pose a question to Professor Lampton and to John. Do you think that the US is more sensitive to the multi-alignment by Southeast Asian countries, meaning that the impact over US policy is more significant? The alignment choices or the strategies, hedging by Southeast Asian countries, do they change US strategy, or US strategy is also quite independent from what Southeast Asia does?
I think the US has its strategy, and it's trying to bring in as many as it can to be in a supportive role, but that there's an enormous amount of inertia behind our basic strategy, and it's not determined by this region. It's determined, I think, by big power relations. And somewhere in American thinking, you've got to crank in the no limits partnership with Russia and China, and the increasing alignment of China, North Korea, Iran, at least in American thinking. And I think that's the level that we're operating. But I wanted to ask just a little thought experiment. What would Southeast Asia do if literally kinetic conflict arose in the Taiwan Strait? What would the countries of Southeast Asia do? And I was trying to just do a little back of the envelope. This would fragment Southeast Asia. I don't know that I have all of them going into the right corners. They'd probably try to stay out of it as much as possible, but that may not be possible. And so, you know, you've got Cambodia and Myanmar that might go in one direction. You've got Singapore, maybe in another direction. But you know, what does Thailand do? It's already an ally of the United States, but it's buying submarines from China. So what are they gonna do? Vietnam is increasing its military alliance, but if this thing gets out of control, where does Vietnam go? Right? So I think the US has its strategy, and at any given moment, we're opportunistic in who we're trying to rope into it. But when things really change, I think everybody's going to be going in different directions. And that gets me back to the point that I think undergirds everything we've said. It's really in our interest, ASEAN work. That's a, but I don't think, frankly, the big powers don't pay. They try to get friends, but they don't determine the strategy.
Okay, let's move on to I'm so sorry. Would you like to? I think we'll take one more question from the audience here.
Prashant with the Wilson Center. I actually wanted to go back to a point that Professor Lampton raised earlier, which is a really interesting question, which is if competition wasn't the paradigm, there are other candidates, and we've seen actually the US and the US government, to give them some credit, come up with some alternatives over time, or bumper stickers or slogans. You know, there have been sort of talk about connectivity. There was a Billion Futures initiative. And there is this paradigm of a free and open Indo-Pacific as well. I think the issue is that there's problems with each of these because the US has to manage very complex domestic realities as well as a very diverse region. And that's very difficult to sort of balance from those realities. So free and open, that's being done at a time where there's questions about freedom and openness in Washington, but also freedom and openness in Southeast Asia. So my question is, what would a paradigm be that would work for both these very complex domestic realities, but also for complex regional realities? So positive affirmative slogans like free and open, Billion Futures, they sound really good, but it's hard for the United States to muster the resources and means and ends. It's often easier to do it when you have a threat rather than opportunities. But when you frame it as a threat, it doesn't work in the region. So I remember one former US ambassador sort of saying jokingly, if only we could, in an environment, talk about competition domestically, but talk about cooperation in the region, and nobody would know the difference. You know, that would be great. But we don't live in a world like that. So how do we come up with a slogan that satisfies or balances both of those realities? Thank you.
Any thought from the panel, maybe John? No. Okay.
It was a surprise. As you were talking, the book that Cheng-Chwee and Selena and I did, talked about thinking about it as balance. What is our objective that's positive, that you can use the same vocabulary at home that you can use abroad? That's the problem, right? So I think a concept that's useful, and which we argued for, is something called balanced connectivity. The world is going to be connected, but to a greater or lesser extent, and vary by region, I suppose. But connectivity, it seems to me, is a concept in alignment with economic and ecological reality, right? And balanced is good. Right now, China is building all the north-south connectivity. And everybody in the region and outside the region has to ask, is everything hooked to Beijing in our interest? And I don't think it is, actually. Shouldn't we be building connectivity from India across Cambodia and Myanmar and Vietnam so that we don't try to oppose everything China's doing? We try to shape the forces in a way that creates stability and growth, right? So I don't see how somebody could take an issue with the idea of balanced connectivity. We're not trying to decouple. We don't mind de-risking, but we're not trying to decouple. We're not trying to oppose China. We can even imagine joint efforts to increase balance, and right? So that's how my mind works on that.
Yes, John, please.
I mean, if you go back to 2008, when Barack Obama was elected president, and it was sort of like you had two presidential candidates, right, in Barack Obama and John McCain, who had a genuine interest in Southeast Asia for various reasons, which we're all aware of. And, you know, looking at it, I think it was taken at least seriously as a, you know, looking at it a comprehensive, integrated fashion, right? Looking at the region. Problem is that the resources, was a resource deprived policy. And I think the economic leg of US policy towards Southeast Asia is, at least amongst those in the region, is lacking in comparison. I don't think anyone, you know, in terms of, some people might think it's an over-securitization of our policy in Southeast Asia. Some people might think it's just right. I think it depends on the country you ask. People-to-people ties, you know, we're not, you know, we're not sending as many people to, you know, study for their PhDs and things, but we're doing other types of programs. And so but the economic leg is the real sort of short leg of the three-legged stool, you know, that's US policy towards Southeast Asia. And I think without an economic policy that is commensurate with these other policies, you know, security and people-to-people ties, soft power, I think the region will feel that it's lacking. And that's also, it's all relative. I remember there might have been one or two people in this room that went to this conference in Kunming in 2008. And the Chinese host got up and announced that for the first time, China was, and the US, pardon me, China and Southeast Asia, China was doing more trade with Southeast Asia. And it was like a difference between, I don't know, 215 billion to 213 billion, but it was pretty, you know, pretty narrow. And then he announced that it would certainly double, probably triple, maybe even quadruple. You know, the Americans in the room, their eyes got really big. And, but if you look at the trade now, US trade's growing, right? It's up to, you know, 15 years later, up to about, you know, 522 billion, somewhere around there. Well, China's 970 billion, right? So more than quadrupled, right? And so it's, you know, where we, and that was the first time when that exceeded, it was the first time, other than for the interruption during World War II, for obvious reasons, where the US wasn't Southeast Asia's largest trading partner since 1873. Ulysses S. Grant was president. So, you know, this is also emblematic of China's rise and how to grapple with this and how to figure that out. So I just wanted to provide some, at least medium terms.
Thank you, John. That's a great observation. This resources deprived policy and the inconvenient truth is, if you want to get resources, tie it up to great power competition, and then you can get the resources that you need. But that potentially would not be constructive for the policy directions that we're going to. We have one question from, Professor. Can I ask you this question from Brian Harding? He has been waiting for a while. He's right that we cannot have a discussion about Southeast Asia today without talking about the Philippines. We briefly talked about Philippines. So Brian's question is, how was the Philippines discussed in the Bangkok seminar, in the Bangkok workshop? And what steps could China take to reassure the Philippines and by extension, the United States? So any thoughts on that? My personal recollection is that Philippines was discussed as an outlier.
Yes. It was discussed as an outlier. It also came at the time of the Bangkok workshop where there was the squad was, unofficially was sort of announced. And so it was something where you were looking at the U.S. effort as, has been described by an administration official as the lattice work of, in terms of relationships and alliances. But there was clearly a Southeast Asian view was that, and as Cheng-Chwee, mentioned just earlier, that the Philippines was an outlier in relation to the other countries in terms of its overt stance and how they thought of the situation in the South China Sea.
Cheng-Chwee, would you have anything to add?
A quick point to echo what John just mentioned is that what the question actually reminds me of what Joseph Naya highlighted about containment, right? Only China can contain China. So meaning that whether or not countries in Southeast Asia will kind of like gang up with the US-led coalition or alliance, it depends not so much about how US is going to sell the package, but depends largely on China's action. If China threaten, almost all countries the way Philippines is feeling now, immediate danger and then all that, then I think naturally countries will react in a similar way. So what I'm saying is that it is a function of both the level of danger, the level of threat. Secondly, also about the perceived reliability. If you really want to gang up with someone to push back, do you have really a reliable alliance support? I think under the current situation, November is coming. I think this is a question that many US allies and partners in Asia and Europe are asking, right? Do we have options?
Yeah, let's not go there yet. Let's not go there yet. Professor Womack, please. There's a mic. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Okay. Well, it's a pleasure to be here and hear such good summaries of our wonderful discussions in Bangkok, and also to have memories of our 2008 meeting in Hainan. And building on what John said, and also on what CC said about asymmetry, which of course I thoroughly support. We not only have asymmetry between Southeast Asia and the big powers, but the rivalry between the United States and China is also asymmetric, fundamentally asymmetric, and that's a question of locatedness as well as capacities, and it's a question of directions. And so when we look at how Southeast Asia relates to the two countries, it's not just relating to one great power one or great power two, it's related to massive world's largest productive power. And if China's steel exports last year, the top 5 destinations for Chinese steel, 4 of them were in Southeast Asia, or 4 of them were in Pacific Asia. And many of them, and Vietnam was number 1. So you have this relationship that the US could not supplant. That's not a question of a displacement. It may be a displacement of US proportionally, but it's not a displacement of something the US could have done instead. And the same could be said for the types of contributions that the world order that the US built contributes, and that sense of security for small countries in a system in which they can participate. So the asymmetry doesn't end with the big power, middle power relationship or big power ASEAN relationship. Thank you.
Thank you, professors. Thank you for the nuanced comments. I think it definitely adds to the complexity of the issue that we're trying to examine here. Just one last question from an anonymous attendee online. And I think this would be an interesting question for all our 3 authors. Do you have any suggestions for American East Asia or China experts who want to study Southeast Asia, who are new to Southeast Asia? What would you suggest that they study? Yes, Professor.
Well, first of all, I would say, because I did this and in my great collaboration with Cheng-Chwee and Selena Ho, Singapore, Malaysia, United States. This region really can't be studied by one area specialist with knowledge of one area. If you're going to do good comparative work, you've got to have a range of linguistic research skills, Rolodex, all of these things. So the first thing I'd say, it's really worthwhile to study China in connection with an interaction with an outside functional issue or a geographic area or region. But you need a team. So I think we're going to have to, part of what we do is move to team research of a comparative, more explicitly comparative nature.
So it's a comparative approach. Professor Dawei, any advice?
My advice is just you need to spend enough time in the region, in different countries, speaking the local language. I mean, for the US, I think for my American counterparts, with due respect, I think the US really need to rebuild its regional and area studies, which has declined very unfortunately. So I hope that the US can have more experts on specific countries and also the region.
We know that China has been allocating a lot of resources to regional studies and country studies. Professor Kuik?
I agree with what Mike and also Dawei mentioned. And then if there is only one word that I thought Southeast Asia really stand out across the contemporary world, is the word diversity. We are so diverse within the national boundary and across national boundary. And this is where Southeast Asian story should be highlighted and taught and also kind of shared in the current context of a big power competition. We actually acknowledge diversity as a reality, and we try to manage it in a pragmatic way that diversity, differences, dislike, and disagreement is part and parcel of the reality, and that's okay. We don't have to clash because of differences of diversity, right? And I do think that the ASEAN story would be highlighted even more in this current context, in the sense that it tells us that the choices policy people are making should go along this Southeast Asian style of managing diversity. It will not eliminate, we shouldn't be by reality, but how we manage it really is a matter of how the contemporary international relations should be conducted.
Yes, John, please.
Yeah, actually, Dr. Dawei and Dr. Kuik, Cheng-Chwee and I were talking about this yesterday over lunch, and I think that there are 9 or 10 centers for Southeast Asian studies around the United States, and you thought there was a similar number in China, but maybe, yeah, 20. So which is, you know, double the amount, and area studies has in general gone down. I think there's just been a general sense that in political science, at least, much greater emphasis on empiricism. I have nothing against empiricism, but I know that you can't always control your variables, and so with that, I think area studies can play an important part. But that also means, like China's doing in terms of providing resources, I think we need to do that as well. We provide some, I mean, meaning the United States, but not enough. But I also want to flip the coin as well. The Asia Foundation over decades helped to promote American studies, you know, in various Southeast Asian countries. In some of those countries, we were looking at it and supporting of them, but eventually these institutions would sort of go on their own, right? It wouldn't be something where we would support them in perpetuity. And that, for a number of them, did not happen. And I think if it goes both ways, I think Southeast Asian countries, at least some, particularly those that are, you know, advanced middle income countries, should be probably paying more attention, and more support, because the United States nonetheless is going to be an important factor. China is too, and you can have China studies. But I think that Southeast Asian countries should place a little bit more emphasis on that. So thank you.
Well, We are at the end of our session. Thank you so much for joining today. Thank you to our panelists for a great discussion, for your contribution to this wonderful report. There are hard copies outside. Please feel free to take some copies. And with that, I will give the floor back to John. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was a wonderful discussion, and I appreciate all of you coming today and for your questions and comments. This whole program has taken a lot of effort, and one person who has been integral into the success of it is my colleague Vanessa Crawford, sitting over there, and she was helped today by Sonia Norell and Solange Rappas. So thank you all very much for your help today. And as Yun Sun had said earlier, we're sort of taking this on the road. We're going to be up in New York at Columbia and California at UC Berkeley, as well as meeting some other organizations in both places. At the end of this month, on October 30th, we're going to release another report. It's called Critical Issues for the United States and Southeast Asia in 2025. It's a group of 12 Americans that comprise the task force. Some of them are here, or at least were here. Yun is Sun is one of them, but also Frank Januzzi and Barbara Wiesel, and 8 others. We're going to release that report at the Cosmos Club on Wednesday, October 30th, from 10 to 11:30. We realize all time is finite, and we appreciate you taking the time to come today, and we hope that you'll come on October 30th if your schedule allows. So with that, please join me in thanking our panel this afternoon. Thank you for coming.